Thomas Hansen never expected to become a farmer at 45. The software engineer had spent his entire career behind a desk in Seattle, crafting code for a mid-sized tech company that specialized in inventory management systems. His life had fallen into a comfortable routine. Morning coffee at the corner shop, 10 hours of debugging and meetings, takeout dinner, and perhaps a craft beer while watching whatever game was on. It wasn't exciting, but it was stable and predictable. Then came the call that changed everything. "I'm sorry to inform you that your grandfather, Harold Hansen, has passed away." The lawyer's voice had been professionally sympathetic on the phone. Thomas had sat down hard on his ergonomic office chair, memories flooding back of summer days spent running through cornfields and helping to feed chickens. Grandpa Harold had been a constant in Thomas's childhood, especially after his parents' divorce. The farm in rural Montana had been Thomas's sanctuary during those tumultuous years, minus 120 acres of land that had been in the Hansen family for 3 generations. Thomas hadn't visited in nearly 8 years, always too busy with deadlines and projects that somehow seemed urgent, but in retrospect probably weren't. The lawyer continued, "Mr. Hansen left the entirety of his estate to you, including the farm and all its assets. There are some papers you'll need to sign." Thomas barely heard the rest. His grandfather had 2 other grandchildren, cousins Thomas had grown up with. Why him? The question haunted him as he flew to Montana for the funeral, a somber affair attended by what seemed like the entire county. Harold Hansen had been respected, a pillar of the community who still farmed the old-fashioned way and remembered everyone's names at the market. "He talked about you all the time," Mary Wilkins, his grandfather's neighbor for 30 years, told him at the reception. "Said you have a Hansen common sense, even if you were buried in that computer world. He kept every article about your company, had them in a scrapbook." That night, Thomas sat alone on the porch of the farmhouse, the same spot where his grandfather had taught him to whittle wood and identify constellations. The air smelled of earth and possibility. In the distance, he could see the lights of Bridgewater Estates, a newer suburban development that had sprung up over the last decade, encroaching on what had once been nothing but farmland as far as the eye could see. For 3 weeks, Thomas stayed at the farm, ostensibly to sort through his grandfather's affairs. He took conference calls from the kitchen, where his grandmother had once made apple pies. He answered emails while sitting beside the old tractor his grandfather had lovingly maintained for 40 years. Something was happening to him. Something unexpected. After much deliberation, Thomas made the most impulsive decision of his meticulously planned life. He called his boss, quit his job, listed his sleek downtown condo, and began researching organic farming techniques. Friends thought he was having a midlife crisis. Perhaps he was, but as he sold or donated most of his possessions and prepared to move permanently to Montana, Thomas felt more clarity than he had in years. By the time spring arrived, Thomas Hansen, former software engineer, had become a novice farmer. The learning curve was steep and often humbling. His hands, once smooth from keyboard work, grew calloused. His designer wardrobe gave way to practical flannel and denim. The farm remained undeveloped and agricultural, just as his grandfather had kept it, an increasingly rare holdout in an area being rapidly transformed by development. 3 months into his new life as a farmer, Thomas had settled into a rhythm. The spring planting was complete, the ancient irrigation system had been painstakingly repaired, and he'd even managed to fix the roof of the barn with only 3 smashed thumbs to show for it. For the first time since his childhood, he felt genuinely content. His days had purpose, his sleep was deep, and the constant anxiety that had plagued him in Seattle had receded like morning mist. Then came the letter that shattered his peace. It arrived on a Tuesday, nestled between a C catalog and a utility bill. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive-looking, with Bridgewater Estates Homeowners Association printed in an elegant font across the top. Thomas stared at it, puzzled. He'd exchanged friendly waves with some of the development residents when they walked or jogged past his property, but he'd had no official contact with their HOA. "Probably a welcome to the neighborhood thing," he muttered to himself as he sliced open the envelope with his grandfather's old pocket knife. The contents, however, were anything but welcoming. The letter, signed by HOA President Richard Keller, informed Thomas that due to a recently approved county rezoning measure, his property now fell under Bridgewater Estates HOA jurisdiction. It detailed immediate obligations, monthly dues of $350, a special assessment of $5,000 for community improvements, due within 30 days, and a comprehensive list of violations that needed to be remediated within 2 weeks, including excessive agricultural equipment visible from community roads and unstandardized fencing. Thomas's confusion turned to disbelief as he reached the final page, a document requiring his signature that would transfer mineral rights to the HOA as per Section 12.3 of the community bylaws. A yellow post-it note with an arrow pointing to the signature line read, "Please sign and return promptly to avoid further fees." "This has to be some kind of mistake," Thomas said aloud, though only the farm cat, stretched on the kitchen windowsill, was there to hear him. His farm predated Bridgewater Estates by decades. His grandfather had often complained about the development breaking ground 15 years ago. There was no logical way his property could have been incorporated into their HOA jurisdiction without his knowledge or consent. That night, Thomas could barely sleep. His mind raced with questions and a growing sense of unease. At dawn, he drove into town and used the library's computer to search county records. Nothing about rezoning appeared in any recent board meetings. He called the county clerk's office as soon as they opened, only to be told that while there had been some discussion about rezoning in the area, no official measures had been approved affecting his property. 3 days later, a second letter arrived. This one marked urgent. Sick and a note to see. It referenced his failure to respond to the first communication and mentioned accumulating late fees. The tone was less bureaucratic and more threatening, alluding to possible legal action and liens against his property if he continued to obstruct community governance. Thomas placed both letters in a folder labeled it HOA nonsense and tried to focus on his farm work. But the seed of worry had been planted, taking root alongside his crops. Something wasn't right, and the pristine fields he'd inherited suddenly felt less secure beneath his feet. The third letter from Bridgewater Estates HOA arrived with a certified mail sticker requiring his signature. Thomas signed for it with a growing knot in his stomach, then opened it immediately in his dusty pickup truck. This one included printouts of county ordinances, highlighted in aggressive yellow, and photographs of his property with circled violations. The tone had escalated from officiously threatening to outright hostile. That afternoon, Thomas called Eleanor Simmons, a local attorney his grandfather had mentioned with respect. "I don't typically handle property disputes," she said after reviewing his documents, "but something doesn't add up here. This isn't standard HOA procedure even for the aggressive ones." Eleanor agreed to make some inquiries, and Thomas threw himself into his own investigation with the same methodical approach he'd once applied to debugging complex code. He spent 3 full days at the county records office, poring over property maps, deed restrictions, and zoning regulations. The clerk, a woman named Dottie who remembered his grandfather fondly, stayed late to help him navigate the labyrinthine filing system. "Your granddad fought the Bridgewater development tooth and nail," she told him over coffee from her thermos. "Spoke at every public hearing. Said it would change the character of the whole valley." Thomas also drove to the homes of elderly neighbors who had lived in the area for decades, collecting their recollections and any documents they kept. Martha Jenkins, 82 and sharp as a tack, pulled out a box of newspaper clippings. "I never throw anything away," she said proudly, handing him a yellowed article about the original Bridgewater development. "Your grandfather and I both suspected there was more to that development than nice houses for city folks." The picture that emerged was troubling. Bridgewater Estates was built on land once owned by Western Mining Corporation, which had retained mineral rights when selling to developers in 2005. The corporation had gone bankrupt in 2013, and their assets, including those mineral rights, had been purchased by a holding company called Northstar Ventures. On his 4th day of investigation, Thomas discovered the connection he'd been missing. Richard Keller, the HOA president who had signed all 3 letters, was listed as a former executive at Western Mining and currently served as a consultant for Northstar Ventures. The final piece fell into place when Eleanor called. "I spoke with a geologist friend at the university," she said. "There were preliminary surveys conducted last year that indicated potential natural gas deposits in the area. The reports aren't public, but they're generating buzz in certain circles. The deposits apparently extend under both Bridgewater and several surrounding properties, including yours." That evening, Thomas attended a town council meeting. He didn't speak, just listened from the back row as various community matters were discussed. When the meeting opened for public comments, Richard Keller stepped up to the microphone. Tall, tanned, and radiating authority in his expensive suit, he spoke eloquently about a petition to streamline zoning regulations for community cohesion. Thomas watched as Keller handed the council members folders with what appeared to be the same highlighted ordinances he'd received in his letters. No mention was made of mineral rights or natural gas, but Thomas now understood what he was witnessing: the orchestration of a land grab with his family farm as collateral damage. The morning after the town council meeting, Thomas found a notice taped to his mailbox. Bold red letters declared, "Final WARNING before enforcement." At the bottom was Richard Keller's signature, now familiar to Thomas, with the addition of "acting on behalf of Bridgewater Estates Community Standards Committee." Thomas removed it, adding it to his growing file of HOA correspondence. As he walked back to the house, he noticed an unfamiliar black SUV driving slowly past his property. The driver, a woman in sunglasses, held up her phone, clearly taking photos. When she saw Thomas watching, she accelerated and disappeared down the road. "It's beginning," Thomas murmured to himself. Over the next week, the surveillance became constant. Different vehicles would park across from his farm, sometimes for hours. Thomas installed a simple security camera system, his tech background proving useful, and documented each incident. The footage showed people photographing his property, measuring his fence line, and in one case, a man in a suit walking 20 feet onto his land before retreating when Thomas's farm dog began barking. His phone began ringing with calls from unfamiliar numbers. When he answered, the caller would hang up. His email inbox filled with notices of supposed violations, each with increasingly punitive fines: $500 for non-compliant agricultural equipment storage, $750 for unauthorized livestock shelters, $1,200 for failure to maintain community aesthetic standards. On Saturday, Thomas received a formal notice of lien being placed on his property for failure to remit required community dues and assessments. The amount had somehow ballooned to $15,750. The document appeared official but listed a county file number that, when Thomas checked online, didn't exist. "They're trying to wear you down," Eleanor told him over lunch at the town's only diner. "It's a common tactic. Create enough pressure and most people eventually give in, even when they're in the right." The following Tuesday evening was the monthly Bridgewater Estates HOA meeting. Though not a member, Thomas decided to attend, hoping to address the harassment directly. He arrived at the community center to find the doors locked, despite being 10 minutes early according to the posted schedule. Through the windows, he could see the meeting already in progress, with Richard Keller standing at a podium before approximately 30 residents. Thomas knocked on the glass door. A security guard he hadn't noticed approached from inside, shaking his head and pointing to a private meeting sign that hadn't been there when Thomas arrived. As he stood there, frustrated, he felt a tap on his shoulder. "You won't get in." "I tried," said a woman about his age, dressed in running clothes. "I'm Rebecca Wilson, Bridgewater resident. You must be Thomas Hansen." Over coffee at a nearby cafe, Rebecca explained that she'd noticed the escalating situation from HOA meeting minutes. As a newer resident who had purchased her home just a year ago, she hadn't been aware of the history, but had become concerned when Keller had started using increasingly aggressive language about incorporating adjacent properties. At last month's meeting, Keller told everyone that adding your eyesore farm to our HOA would increase property values by at least 15%, she said. He promised that revenue from mineral leasing would eliminate our HOA fees for years. Most people were thrilled. Nobody likes paying $350 a month. When I asked questions about legality, I was basically shouted down. Thomas thanked her for the information. As they parted, Rebecca hesitated. "Be careful," she said. "Keller has most of the community convinced you're some kind of obstinate outsider threatening their financial interests. People are angry, and they don't even know why they should be suspicious." After his conversation with Rebecca, Thomas realized that direct confrontation wasn't working. Keller had too much influence, too many resources, and the emotional leverage of an entire community behind him. To win this battle, Thomas would need to change tactics completely. He called Eleanor for an emergency strategy session. They met at her office on a Sunday when no one else was around. For hours, they mapped out options on her whiteboard, discarding approaches that seemed too risky or ineffective. By evening, a plan had taken shape. Not a single action, but a coordinated campaign on multiple fronts. "It's going to take time," Eleanor warned, "and you'll need to be methodical. Are you sure you're up for this?" Thomas thought of his grandfather, who had fought to preserve the farm for future generations. Absolutely. The first phase began quietly. With Eleanor's guidance, Thomas filed paperwork with the State Agricultural Commission for historical agricultural designation. His grandfather's meticulous record-keeping proved invaluable, demonstrating continuous farming operations since 1925. The designation, when approved 6 weeks later, provided a powerful legal shield against certain types of zoning changes. Simultaneously, Thomas reached out to the 4 other farmers in the area who had received similar letters from Bridgewater Estates. Initially reluctant to get involved, they became allies when Thomas shared copies of the geological survey Rebecca had managed to obtain from a sympathetic county clerk. "This isn't just about your farm or my orchard," Thomas told them during a meeting in Hank Miller's barn. "This is about them taking what isn't theirs to take." The third phase required the most delicacy. Working with Eleanor and a private investigator she trusted, Thomas began examining the rezoning petition Keller had submitted to the county board. What they found exceeded their expectations. Signatures that didn't match voter registration cards, addresses listed for people who had moved away years ago, and most damning, statements attributed to county officials that those same officials later denied making when Eleanor contacted them discreetly. But Thomas' masterstroke came from his previous life. Over 3 intensive weeks, fueled by coffee and determination, he created a comprehensive website called Bridgewater Truth. The site featured an interactive timeline of events, scanned copies of all correspondence, with sensitive information redacted, video clips from his security cameras showing HOA representatives trespassing, and affidavits from the farmers who had been targeted. Most powerfully, he included side-by-side comparisons of the signatures on the rezoning petition with actual signatures from county records, highlighting obvious discrepancies. A section called Follow the Money traced Keller's connections to Western Mining and North Star Ventures, complete with corporate filings and news articles. The website went live on a Tuesday morning. Thomas sent the link to local media outlets with a simple subject line: HOA attempting illegal land grab for mineral rights. By that afternoon, the county's most popular news blog had published a feature. By evening, the local TV station was requesting an interview. Rebecca, who had become a valuable ally, discreetly shared the link in the Bridgewater Estates Community Facebook group, where it spread like wildfire among residents who had been kept in the dark about Keller's true motivations. Thomas was prepared for retaliation, but what he wasn't prepared for was the complete silence from the HOA. For the first time in months, no cars drove by his property. No letters arrived. The sudden absence of harassment was almost more unsettling than his presence had been. The county board called an emergency hearing just 10 days after the website went live. The small meeting room was packed beyond capacity with farmers, Bridgewater residents, and local media squeezed into every available space. Thomas sat in the front row beside Eleanor, hands folded calmly in his lap despite his racing heart. Richard Keller arrived flanked by 2 attorneys in expensive suits. His confident smirk faltered when he saw 3 members of the county sheriff's department standing against the wall. The board chairwoman, Frances Martinez, began the proceedings with unusual solemnity. "We're here to review serious allegations regarding the Bridgewater Estates rezoning petition," she announced. "Mr. Keller, as the petitioner, you'll have an opportunity to address these concerns." When Keller's turn came, his attorney attempted to dismiss the allegations as a misunderstanding between neighbors. But when Francis asked Keller directly about the signatures that didn't match county records, his attorney quickly intervened. "My client will not be answering questions at this time," he said stiffly. "Is your client willing to testify under oath about the preparation of this petition?" Francis pressed. After a whispered conference, Keller's attorney replied, "We're exercising our right to delay testimony pending a full review of the documentation." Similar refusals came from 3 other HOA board members present. By contrast, Thomas and Eleanor presented a methodical case, backed by affidavits, records, and expert testimony from the county's own zoning administrator, who confirmed that the petition had bypassed several required reviews. The board's vote was unanimous. The rezoning decision was immediately reversed, with all properties incorrectly incorporated into Bridgewater Estates returned to their original zoning status. Furthermore, the board referred the matter to the state attorney general's office for investigation of possible fraud. As Thomas left the hearing, Rebecca approached with several Bridgewater residents. "We had an emergency community meeting last night," she explained. "Keller didn't show up. We voted to remove the entire board and elect new representatives." She handed Thomas a formal letter. "This is an official acknowledgement that your farm was never subject to our jurisdiction and an apology for the harassment." Within a week, local real estate listings showed that Richard Keller had put his house up for sale. The investigation by the Attorney General's office expanded to include North Star Ventures business practices across the state. 2 months later, Thomas received a call from the investigating attorney. "The gas deposits under your property," she told him. "Our geological experts say they're much smaller than initially estimated, barely worth extracting, especially with current prices." Thomas couldn't help but laugh at the irony. With the immediate threat resolved, Thomas turned his attention to long-term protection. Working with a land conservation trust, he placed 100 of his 120 acres into a permanent agricultural easement that would prevent development regardless of who owned the property in the future. Most importantly, the trust agreement explicitly kept all mineral rights with the land itself, preventing any future attempts at extraction without the landowner's consent. As autumn arrived, bringing the harvest season, Thomas invited all the farmers who had fought alongside him, along with Rebecca and the new HOA board, to a celebration dinner in his newly renovated barn. They ate at tables made from wood his grandfather had milled decades ago, under strings of lights that made the old structure feel magical. "To standing your ground," Eleanor toasted, raising her glass. Thomas had never planned to become a farmer and certainly never expected to become a community leader. Yet as he looked around at the unlikely coalition he'd brought together, farmers and suburbanites, elderly neighbors, and young families, he realized something his grandfather had often said finally made sense. The most valuable thing about land wasn't what you could take from it, but what it could bring together.